Do you know what it feels like to lose 23 years of your life to a lie? That's the question I've been asking myself for 3 years now. Not the kind of question you ask out loud at dinner parties or mention casually to the people who raised you. It's the question that wakes you up at 3 in the morning, the one that makes you question every memory, every conversation, every photograph. My name is Evelyn Hartwell. No, wait, that's not actually my name. That's the name the woman who wasn't my real mother gave me. Evelyn. She always said it meant wished for child. The irony is suffocating when you understand what that really meant in the context of my life. I'm telling you this story because if I don't, no one will. And more importantly, because somewhere out there, someone might recognize themselves in what I'm about to tell you. Someone might be living with the same hollow feeling I carried for 2 decades, never quite understanding why the world felt like it was happening to someone else. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're watching this from right now. Are you at home? In your car? Maybe at work during a break? What's the weather like where you are? I ask because in a moment, I'm going to tell you something that will make you want to check the locks on your doors and hold your children a little tighter if you have them. And I want you to know that I'm right here with you, wherever you are, carrying this weight with me. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of my life, I don't remember that part. I'm talking about the beginning of the end. The moment when everything I believed about myself shattered like glass on concrete. I was 23 years old. I had just graduated from university with a degree in business administration. My life looked perfect on paper. I had a family, a decent job lined up at a marketing firm, an apartment I was about to move into, and a boyfriend named Daniel who seemed to have his life figured out. To anyone looking at me from the outside, I was one of the lucky ones. I had it all. But there's this thing about carrying lies your whole life. They become so familiar that you stop noticing them. Like living next to train tracks. Eventually, you don't hear the trains anymore. You just feel the vibration under your feet. My adoptive parents, Richard and Margaret Hartwell, were the kind of people who wore their charity like jewelry. They traveled to underprivileged countries, donated to prestigious causes, and always made sure everyone knew about their good deeds. They adopted me when I was 18 months old from what they told me was an orphanage in India. They never provided details beyond that. They said it was for my protection, to ensure that my biological family couldn't show up one day and claim me back. I believed them. I was a child, and children believe their parents because that's how the world works. Your parents are the source of all truth. They know the difference between what's real and what's pretend. That's what I thought anyway. The crack in that foundation appeared on a Tuesday in October. I had gone home to visit my parents for my father's birthday. My mom, Margaret, was preparing this elaborate dinner party, the kind where she'd invite the right people and make sure the right people saw her generosity. My father, Richard, was in his study, doing whatever it was he did behind closed doors. He was a lawyer. A very successful one. The kind of lawyer who represented powerful people who needed problems to disappear. I was in the kitchen helping my mother when the phone call came in. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I did. Margaret's phone had rung, and she stepped out to take it, leaving me alone with the appetizers I was arranging. But I noticed she'd left her phone on the counter, and the person calling didn't hang up. I could hear them through the speaker, shouting. A woman's voice. Angry. Desperate. 23 years, Richard. 23 years I've kept this secret. I can't do this anymore. I'm going to the authorities. She deserves to know the truth. My mother came back into the kitchen, saw the phone, and her entire face went white. She ended the call without saying a word. She didn't even acknowledge that I'd heard anything. She just smiled, that tight smile she used when she was about to serve dinner to guests, and asked me to finish the appetizers. But I couldn't stop thinking about that call. That woman had mentioned 23 years. I had just turned 23. Coincidence, I told myself. It had to be. But the way my mother had reacted, The way she'd become suddenly rigid and careful with her words for the rest of the evening, that wasn't coincidence. 3 days later, my father called me into his study. I remember this because he never called me into his study. He was not a man who sought out his children's company for casual conversation. Everything about that moment felt wrong before he even spoke. "Evelyn," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "I need to talk to you about something important." I sat down. My heart was already racing, and I didn't know why. "There are people who are going to try to contact you," he continued, his voice measured and controlled in a way that made my skin feel too tight. "People who want to tell you things. Untrue things. Hurtful things. I want you to know that your mother and I have always acted in your best interest. Everything we've done has been to protect you." "From what?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. Adoption documents. I'd never actually seen the real ones before. He set them on the desk between us, and I could see my name, my birth date, and something that made my stomach drop. A place of origin I didn't recognize. "You were found," he said carefully. "Not orphaned. Found. In a remote location. You were malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of neglect. Your biological family couldn't care for you. We gave you a life. We gave you everything." "Where was I found?" I whispered. "That's not important," he said. "What's important is that you're ours now. And you have a good life. A future. I won't have anyone jeopardizing that by digging up a past that only brings pain." He didn't explicitly tell me not to ask questions. He didn't have to. I understood the message. This was a subject that existed in the space between his words, in the tone of his voice, in the way his jaw tightened when I started to ask him something else. I left his study feeling like I was walking through water. Everything was muffled. Everything felt distant. Over the next few weeks, I tried to move past it. I told myself he was right. What good would it do to know? I had a family. I had a life. The past was the past. But that woman's voice kept echoing in my head. 23 years. She'd kept a secret for 23 years. And then I started noticing things. Little things. My mother avoiding certain topics. My father becoming hostile if anyone asked about my childhood. The way they seemed to be waiting for something bad to happen, like they were bracing for impact. 2 months after that conversation in his study, I woke up to find my parents in my bedroom at 7 in the morning. My mother was pale. My father looked angry. They told me we needed to talk about something urgent. "Your biological mother has decided to pursue contact," my father said bluntly. "We've retained a lawyer to handle this. You will not, under any circumstances, respond to any communication from her. You will not meet with her. You will not listen to anything she has to say. Am I clear?" I nodded, but inside, I was reeling. So the woman on the phone, the woman who'd mentioned 23 years, that was my biological mother. She was alive. She was looking for me. And my father would rather I disappear than let her find me. That's when I knew something was fundamentally wrong. That's when the lie I'd been living started to feel suffocating. But here's what I didn't know yet. Here's what I couldn't have known, that 23 years before this moment, my father had done something so terrible, so calculated, that he'd been willing to throw away a child to cover it up. And the only person who'd witnessed it was a scared little boy who was playing in the wrong place at the wrong time. That little boy had grown up. He'd become something powerful. Something that scared people like my father. And he was coming for the truth. He just didn't know yet that the truth would change everything. For both of us. What happens next will shock you. But before I continue, I need to know, are you as invested in this as I am? Are you wondering what was in that cave? Are you trying to figure out who that little boy became? Because if you are, then you understand exactly why I had to tell this story. You understand that some truths are so important, they're worth destroying your entire life to expose. I'm going to take you deeper into this story in the next section. But for now, sit with this. My adoptive father didn't just lie to me. He orchestrated my disappearance. And the only person who could prove it was someone I'd never met. Someone who'd spent 23 years carrying a secret that was about to blow open. If you want to know what happened next, if you want to understand how I went from a woman who accepted her perfect lie to someone willing to tear down an entire family's reputation, then come back with me. Because this is where the real story begins. To understand what happened to me in that cave, you need to understand who I was before everything fell apart. Not the person I am now, the one telling you this story. I mean the girl I was when I still believed my parents loved me unconditionally. When I thought the world was fair and that good people existed in my life. I was born in 1990. Or at least, that's what my birth certificate said. Looking back now, I'm not even sure that date is real. But I'll use it because it's all I have. My earliest memory is not of my biological family. It's of my adoptive mother, Margaret, holding me in a sunlit room. I must have been around 3 years old. She was singing to me badly, I might add. She couldn't carry a tune, and even as a small child, I remember thinking it was funny. She was wearing a white linen dress, and there was this garden visible through the windows behind her. Everything in that memory feels sanitized, like a photograph that's been retouched to remove all the real details. That's the memory I held onto for 23 years. That's the memory I used to justify their love, their sacrifice, their generosity. A woman singing off-key in a white dress. That's what I used to counter every uncomfortable feeling, every moment of doubt. My father, Richard, was a different kind of presence. He was the man who built the foundation that the rest of my life would sit on. He was a partner at Hartwell and Associates, a prestigious law firm in the city. He represented corporate clients, high-net-worth individuals, and occasionally, people who needed their problems to disappear. That was his specialty, actually. Making problems disappear. I didn't realize that until much later. When I was a child, Richard was the man who came home at 7 o'clock every evening, kissed my mother on the cheek, and asked me about my day. He was the man who attended my school recitals and took photographs. He was the man who seemed to have everything figured out, everything controlled, everything perfect. But there's a difference between appearing present and actually being there. Richard mastered the appearance. The actual presence? That required vulnerability, and my father didn't do vulnerability. I had a younger brother, Thomas. He was biologically my parents' child, born 2 years after they adopted me. This is important because it's where the real fault lines in my family started to show, though I didn't recognize them at the time. Thomas was the golden child in a way I could never be. He was their biological son. Their real son. I understand now that they probably loved him differently, more fiercely, because he carried their DNA. But as a child, I just felt the distance. I felt the way they looked at him with a kind of pride they never quite managed when they looked at me. I felt like I was always auditioning for a role I'd never secure. Thomas was 7 when everything started to change. I was 9. I remember my mother becoming obsessed with a secret. I didn't know it was a secret at the time, but I recognized the signs. The whispered phone calls. The way she'd hang up when I entered a room. The way she and my father would exchange looks across the dinner table that seemed to contain entire conversations. One evening, I was supposed to be in bed, but I was thirsty. I came downstairs to get water from the kitchen, and I heard my parents talking in Richard's study. The door was open just enough that I could hear them without being seen. My mother was crying. Actual tears, not the performative tears she used when guests were over. "We can't keep doing this," she was saying. "It's not fair to her. She deserves to know the truth." "She deserves a life," my father replied, his voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. "And she'll have one. As long as no one ever knows what happened." I didn't understand what he meant. I was 9 years old, and I didn't have the context to understand that my father was basically telling my mother that my entire existence was contingent on silence. On lies. On the maintenance of a carefully constructed narrative. What if someone finds out? My mother pressed. They won't, he said. I've made sure of that. The records are sealed. The location is remote. And the only person who knew what happened is dead. I remember standing in that hallway, gripping my empty water glass, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't name. It was the first real moment of doubt. The first crack in the foundation. But I was 9. I didn't follow my instincts. Instead, I went back to bed, and I tried to forget what I'd heard. I told myself I'd misunderstood. I told myself my father would never do anything wrong. He was a lawyer. He represented justice. That's what I needed to believe. Over the next few years, my relationship with my parents became more complicated. Not in any obvious way. On the surface, everything looked normal. We had family dinners. We took vacations. We attended church on Sundays. We looked like the perfect family. But underneath, there was this current of anxiety that never quite went away. My mother became more controlling, more obsessed with my appearance, my behavior, my academic performance. It was like she was trying to mold me into something that would justify keeping me. Something that would prove she'd made the right choice. My father became more distant. He spent more time at the office. More time in his study. More time away from the house. When he was present, there was this guardedness about him, like he was always waiting for something to go wrong. And Thomas, my younger brother, he became the repository for all their love and attention. They didn't have to worry about Thomas. They didn't have to wonder if he was going to disrupt the carefully constructed narrative of their lives. Thomas was theirs, completely and unambiguously. I was the complication. The secret. The thing they had to manage. By the time I was 13, I'd learned to be invisible in my own home. I'd learned to ask the right questions, the ones that wouldn't probe too deeply. I'd learned to accept the answers I was given without demanding more information. I'd learned that curiosity about my origins was a threat to the family's stability, and if I loved my parents, I would stop being curious. So I stopped. I threw myself into school. I got excellent grades. I was quiet, polite, well-behaved. I was exactly the kind of daughter that adoptive parents dream about, grateful, compliant, undemanding. I never argued about curfew. I never snuck out. I never gave my parents any reason to worry about me. Because I understood, on some level I couldn't articulate, that my place in this family was conditional. That if I caused any trouble, if I became any kind of burden, I could be removed. The same way I'd apparently been removed from somewhere else, before I could even remember it. I was 6 years old when I understood that I was grateful. That's not a normal age to feel gratitude as a way of ensuring survival. But that's what my childhood was. When I was 16, my father called me into his study. This was unusual. My father didn't seek me out. So I was already nervous when I sat down across from him. Your mother and I have been discussing your future, he said, his tone careful and measured. We think it's important that you understand your position in this family. You've been a good daughter. You've been respectful and obedient. We want you to know that we value you. The way he said it, the way he framed it as a transaction, an exchange of my compliance for their love, that should have been a red flag. But I was 16, and I was just grateful to hear that they valued me at all. Thank you, I said quietly. There will come a time when you're old enough to make your own decisions, he continued. But until then, there are things you need to understand. Your adoption was not a simple matter. There were complications. Circumstances. We did what we thought was best for you at the time. But there are people who might try to contact you. People who might tell you things that aren't true. I need you to promise me that you'll come to us first. That you'll let us explain before you believe anyone else. I promised. Of course I promised. I was desperate to believe that my parents loved me, that they had my best interests at heart, that their silence about my past was protective rather than destructive. Good, he said. That's all I needed to hear. He didn't explain what those complications were. He didn't tell me what the circumstances were. He just made sure I understood that my loyalty to him and my mother was the price I had to pay for belonging to this family. And I paid it. I paid it through my teenage years. I paid it through my choice of friends. I selected people my parents would approve of. I paid it through my career plans. I chose business instead of journalism because journalism involved asking uncomfortable questions. I paid it through my relationship with Daniel, who was exactly the kind of boyfriend my parents felt comfortable with. Safe, predictable, wealthy, someone who would never challenge the narrative. Everything about my life was constructed to keep my parents' secret safe. Everything was arranged so that no one would ever ask me too many questions about where I came from, who I was, or why I seemed to carry this invisible weight that I couldn't quite explain. By 23, I was suffocating under the weight of my own gratitude. I didn't realize it at the time. I thought I was happy. I thought I was living the life I was supposed to live. But there was this hollow feeling that I couldn't shake. This sense that I was playing a part instead of living a life. That I was performing the role of the grateful adopted daughter, and somewhere underneath all those performances, there was a real person who was slowly disappearing. That's the girl I was when that phone call came through. That's who I was before everything changed. But I wasn't alone in carrying this weight. There was someone else. Someone who'd been carrying it much longer than I had. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know that he'd spent the last 15 years training himself to be a weapon specifically designed to expose people like my father. I didn't know that he'd chosen his career deliberately, that every story he pursued, every investigation he conducted, was leading him back to one specific moment in time. One specific cave. One specific little girl who'd been left behind. His name was Nathan Cross, and he was about to turn my entire world inside out. But before he arrived, there was one more person I needed to understand. One more person who'd been carrying the secret as long as my father had. My biological mother. The woman my father had forbidden me to meet. The woman who, according to my father's carefully constructed narrative, had abandoned me in that remote location and left me to die. But that woman had kept searching for me. For 23 years, she'd kept searching. And she was finally running out of patience. 3 weeks after my father's warning about people trying to contact me, I received a letter. It came to my apartment, addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. My hands were shaking when I opened it. "My name is Priya Kapoor," it began. "And I'm your mother. Not the woman who raised you. Your real mother. The one your father paid to disappear." I read that letter 17 times. I memorized every word. And then I burned it, terrified that my father would somehow know I'd received it. But the damage was done. The seed had been planted. And I couldn't stop wondering anymore. I couldn't maintain the fiction that my parents had my best interests at heart. Because if they did, they wouldn't have to forbid me from hearing my own mother's voice. Something inside me was breaking open. Something that had been sealed shut since I was 18 months old. And that something was about to meet the little boy who'd watched it all happen from behind a rock in the darkness. That little boy was now a man with a camera, a recorder, and the kind of determination that comes from carrying an impossible secret for far too long. He was coming to set me free. He just didn't know yet that setting me free would require destroying the only family I'd ever known. I didn't know Nathan Cross existed until he showed up at my workplace. It was a Tuesday morning in March. I was 3 months into my job at the marketing firm, sitting at my desk reviewing social media analytics for a client, when my boss called me into her office. "There's someone here asking to speak with you," she said, her expression confused. "He says it's urgent. Says he's a journalist." My stomach dropped. I knew immediately what this was about. My father's warnings echoed in my head. People who want to tell you things. Hurtful things. Untrue things. I walked to the lobby, and there he was. Nathan Cross was nothing like I expected. He was in his mid-30s, with dark hair and the kind of intensity in his eyes that made you feel seen whether you wanted to or not. He was holding a recorder in one hand and a worn notebook in the other. He looked like someone who'd spent his entire life chasing truths that people didn't want exposed. "Evelyn Hartwell?" he asked, standing up. "Yes. My name is Nathan Cross. I'm an investigative journalist. I need to talk to you about what happened to you when you were 18 months old." My coworkers were staring. My boss was hovering nearby, clearly uncomfortable. "Not here," I said quietly. "Can we go outside?" We walked to the coffee shop across the street. I was shaking by the time we sat down. Nathan ordered 2 coffees without asking what I wanted. He set the recorder on the table between us. "I'm going to tell you something that's going to be difficult to hear," he began. "And I want you to know that I have documentation for all of it. I have police reports. I have medical records. I have testimony from 3 separate people. What your father did to you is not an accident. It was deliberate. It was calculated. And it was covered up by people with enough money and power to make it disappear." "What are you talking about?" I whispered, even though I already knew. On some level, I'd always known. When you were 18 months old, your biological father, a man named Ashok Kapoor, died under circumstances that were ruled accidental. But he didn't die accidentally. He was murdered. By your adoptive father, Richard Hartwell. The room started spinning. Your biological mother, Priya, discovered evidence that Richard had killed her husband. In a panic, Richard paid her a massive sum of money to disappear and to never speak about what she knew. But he was terrified that she would change her mind, that she would go to the police. So he decided to ensure her silence in a different way. "How?" I could barely get the word out. "By taking you. By using you as leverage." He told Priya that if she ever tried to make contact, if she ever spoke to anyone about what really happened, he would ensure that you were taken from her permanently. That you'd never know she existed. That you'd grow up believing she'd abandoned you. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to run. I wanted to tell him he was insane, that he was lying, that my father would never do something like that. But I didn't. Instead, I asked him the only question that mattered. "How do you know this?" "Because I was there," he said. "I was the little boy playing near the cave where your father took you the day before he arranged for your adoption. I watched him leave you there. I watched him come back 2 hours later with people who took you away. I was only 5 years old, but I saw everything. My entire body went cold. My family was vacationing in a remote area of the country," Nathan continued. "We were staying in this small village. You have to understand, this was before phones, before cameras everywhere. Your father thought he could do this and no one would ever know. He took you into this cave system about 30 minutes from town. He left you there with barely any supplies. He was planning to let you die and then claim you'd gotten lost. It would have been written off as an accident. A tragic family tragedy." "But I didn't die," I whispered. "No, you didn't. Because I told my parents what I saw. Because my parents were good people who understood the difference between right and wrong. Your father paid off the local police. He paid off hospital staff. He destroyed records. But he couldn't pay off everyone. My parents took photographs. They kept documentation. They tried to help your biological mother, but Richard's lawyers destroyed her credibility. They painted her as unstable, as someone making wild accusations. By the time my parents tried to intervene, you'd already been placed in your adoptive parents' care. The system was already moving. And Richard Hartwell was powerful enough to make sure it kept moving in his direction." I couldn't breathe properly. The coffee in front of me was getting cold. Nathan just sat there, watching me process the fact that my entire life was built on my father's attempt to murder me. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked finally. "Because I became a journalist specifically to investigate what happened to you," Nathan said. "Because I've spent the last 15 years gathering evidence. Because your biological mother is dying, and she deserves to see you before she passes. And because Richard Hartwell is about to be nominated for a federal judgeship, and I'm not going to let that happen while he gets away with murdering your biological father. Everything inside me fractured. My father wasn't just a liar. He was a murderer. He hadn't adopted me out of kindness. He'd taken me to use me as a tool of control. He'd raised me with conditional love specifically so I would stay silent. Everything, every moment of my childhood, every family dinner, every whispered warning, had been orchestrated to keep me complicit in his crime. I have audio, Nathan said, sliding a small device across the table. From 1988. It's your biological mother, Priya, talking to a police officer. Listen to what she says about what happened. I pressed play. My mother's voice came through, younger, terrified, desperate. My husband is dead. Richard Hartwell killed him because Ashok found out what he was doing. Richard was embezzling from his firm. He was moving money through shell companies. Ashok discovered it and threatened to go to the authorities. And Richard killed him. He made it look like an accident, but I know what he did. And now he's taken my baby. He's taken my daughter, and he says if I ever speak about this, if I ever try to reclaim her, he'll make sure I never see her again. He'll make sure I'm institutionalized. He'll take everything from me. The voice stopped. I couldn't feel my hands. There's more, Nathan said quietly. Medical records from the hospital where you were admitted. Examination notes indicating severe dehydration, malnutrition, exposure. The examining physician wrote that you appeared to have been abandoned in harsh conditions. The files were sealed, but I obtained them through legal channels. They document what your father did. He slid a folder across the table. I opened it with hands that weren't mine anymore. Inside were documents with my name on them. Official records confirming everything he was saying. What do you want from me? I asked. I want you to help me take him down, Nathan said. I want to help you reclaim your real identity. I want you to meet your mother before it's too late. And I want justice for your biological father, for Priya, for every person Richard Hartwell has manipulated and destroyed. I should have said no. I should have told him I needed time to process, that I couldn't betray my family, that this was too much, too fast, too devastating. But I didn't say any of those things. Okay, I heard myself say. Tell me what I need to do. Nathan's expression shifted. Relief flooded his face. First, we need to get you somewhere safe, he said. Once Richard realizes I've made contact with you, he's going to do everything in his power to silence you. He's going to threaten you. He's going to try to convince you that I'm lying. He's going to make you choose between him and the truth. And I need you to be somewhere he can't reach you when that happens. When is he going to realize? I asked. Soon, Nathan said. I'm publishing the story in 3 days. Once it goes public, everything changes. 3 days. I had 3 days to decide whether I was going to keep living the lie or step into a truth that would destroy everything I'd ever known. I chose the truth. That afternoon, I left work early. I went home to my apartment and packed a single bag. I didn't call my parents. I didn't send a message. I just disappeared, the way my father had always threatened I would. Nathan was waiting outside my building in his car. Are you sure about this? He asked as I climbed in. No, I said. But I know that staying is worse. We drove for 2 hours until the city disappeared behind us. We ended up at a small house near the coast that Nathan had rented under a false name. He showed me to a bedroom and left me alone with my phone and the knowledge that in 72 hours, my entire world was going to implode. I spent those 3 days reading every document Nathan gave me. I listened to every recording. I studied every photograph. I consumed the evidence of my father's crimes with the desperation of someone trying to understand how the people who raised her could betray her so completely. The story was more complicated than I'd realized. My biological father, Ashok Kapoor, had discovered that Richard was involved in a money laundering scheme. Ashok was a financial auditor who'd been hired to review the firm's accounts. He found irregularities. He found evidence of offshore accounts. He found proof that Richard was stealing from his clients and funneling the money through illegal channels. Ashok had told Priya he was going to report Richard to the authorities. But before he could, Richard arranged an accident. A car crash that was supposed to look random. Ashok died, and it was ruled accidental. When Priya started asking questions, when she threatened to expose what she knew, Richard made his move. He found out she was pregnant with me, about to have me actually. He told her that if she ever spoke about what happened, if she ever tried to come after me, he would ensure that she lost me permanently. Then he adopted me. He used me as insurance, as proof that she had abandoned her own child, because what mother would really leave her baby if she had a choice? She didn't have a choice. Richard had taken that from her. And I'd spent 23 years thinking she'd given me away. On the morning the story was published, Nathan brought me to his office. We sat in front of his computer as the article went live. The headline was devastating. Prominent attorney's nomination derailed by evidence of murder and embezzlement. The story laid out everything. The murder of Ashok Kapoor. The money laundering. The adoption used as blackmail. The sealed records that Richard had falsified. The audio recordings. The documentary evidence. Everything. Within hours, my phone started ringing. My mother first, hysterical, demanding to know if I was safe, where I was, what I'd done. Then my father, his voice cold and controlled, telling me I was making a mistake, that I was being manipulated, that I needed to come home immediately. I didn't answer. I let it all go to voicemail. By evening, the police were at Richard's office with a warrant for his arrest. By the next morning, he'd lawyered up and refused to speak to anyone. And I was free. But freedom, I was about to discover, came with its own kind of devastation. The first week after the story broke was chaos. Richard's legal team filed emergency motions to block the publication. They demanded retractions. They threatened lawsuits against Nathan's publication for defamation and reckless journalism. They called the evidence fabricated, the recordings doctored, the medical records falsified. None of it worked. The story had already spread. News outlets picked it up. Prosecutors opened investigations. The Federal Judiciary Committee suspended Richard's nomination pending the outcome of a criminal inquiry. My phone became a weapon that I couldn't put down. Reporters called constantly. My friends from university reached out, confused and concerned. People from high school sent messages expressing support or doubt. My coworkers texted asking if the story was real, if I was okay, if I needed anything. I responded to none of them. Nathan had moved me to a different safe house, this one in a city 3 hours away. He said it was for my protection. He said Richard had resources, connections, people who could be persuaded to do things that required deniability. "Your father is dangerous," Nathan told me one evening. We were sitting on the back porch of the rental house, watching the sun disappear behind distant trees. Not just because of what he did to you, but because he's been caught. When people like him lose control, they become unpredictable. "What do you mean, people like him?" I asked. People who've spent their entire lives maintaining an image of respectability. People for whom the external world matters more than internal morality. Those people don't just disappear quietly. They fight. They manipulate. They destroy. He was right. 3 days after the story broke, my mother called me directly. Nathan had "No," I said. "But I'm terrified." "Good," he said. "Fear means you're taking this seriously. Fear means you understand what's at stake." What was at stake became clearer when the second story broke. Nathan had been investigating Richard's financial crimes for months. The murder of Ashok Kapoor was one part of a much larger pattern. Richard had been embezzling from his firm's clients for over a decade. He'd stolen millions. He'd hidden the money in offshore accounts. He'd used shell companies and fabricated documentation to cover his tracks. When the audit revealed the discrepancies, Richard had panicked. He'd reached out to one of his criminal associates, a man named Victor Hernandez, and asked him to eliminate the problem. Hernandez had arranged Ashok's accident. But it wasn't supposed to look like murder. It was supposed to look random. Unfortunate. Except Priya had witnessed something. She'd seen Richard at the scene. She'd heard him talking to Hernandez on the phone. She'd put the pieces together. And Richard couldn't let her live with that knowledge. So he'd adopted me. He'd used me as collateral. He'd told Priya that if she ever spoke, if she ever made accusations, he would take me away from her permanently. He would ensure that she was deemed an unfit mother. He would make sure she never saw me again. And she'd believed him. Because Richard had the resources to follow through. Because he'd already proven he was capable of violence. The second story included interviews with financial experts who confirmed the embezzlement. It included depositions from former clients who discovered they'd been defrauded. It included testimony from Victor Hernandez, who'd agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Hernandez's testimony was devastating. He described how Richard had approached him, how he'd explained the situation, how he'd shown Hernandez a photograph of me, a 1-year-old girl, and said, "This is insurance. This is how we make sure the mother stays quiet. She loses the child, she loses everything." Victor Hernandez had arranged Ashok's death the way a professional arranges anything. Cleanly, efficiently, with minimal risk. And my father had used me as a weapon to ensure the mother of a man he'd murdered would stay silent forever. When I read that testimony, I threw up. For hours afterward, I couldn't stop shaking. Nathan brought me water, but I couldn't drink it. He tried to get me to eat, but the thought of food made me nauseous. I just sat on the couch in that rental house and tried to reconcile the man who'd attended my school recitals with the man who'd paid someone to kill my biological father. They couldn't be the same person. Except they were. That's when I realized that Nathan's presence was becoming something more complicated. He was my protector, yes. He was the person providing evidence, security, support. But he was also the person who'd orchestrated the destruction of my entire family. He was the person who'd made the choice to expose everything, knowing the full extent of the damage it would cause. I was grateful to him. I was also beginning to feel trapped by him. One night, about 2 weeks after the story broke, I asked him a question I'd been avoiding. "Why did you really become a journalist?" I asked. "Was it just about what you saw in that cave?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Partly," he said finally. "But I lied about something in my initial account. I wasn't just a random little boy playing nearby. My family was involved in trying to help your biological mother. My parents tried to intervene with the authorities. They tried to help her fight back against your father." "What happened?" I asked. "My father died in a car accident when I was 12, Nathan said. Single vehicle collision. No witnesses. No explanation for why he lost control of the car on a straight stretch of road." I stared at him. "You think Richard killed your father?" "I don't think," Nathan said. "I know. There was no evidence. There was no way to prove it. But I know what I know. And I've spent the last 23 years gathering evidence against him. You're not the first person Richard Hartwell has destroyed. You're just the most important one to me." I didn't know how to respond to that. Nathan had been using me. Not in a manipulative way, exactly. But he'd been using my existence, my story, my pain, to settle a personal vendetta. He'd approached me at my workplace knowing exactly what he was going to expose. He'd guided me into this situation knowing the full extent of the destruction it would cause. And I'd let him, because I'd wanted to believe that the truth mattered more than family loyalty. But now I was beginning to question whether I'd chosen the truth or simply chosen Nathan's version of the truth. "Are you angry?" Nathan asked, reading my expression. "I don't know what I am," I said honestly. "You should be," he said. "You should be angry at me. You should be angry at your father. You should be angry at your mother for not protecting you. You should be angry at a system that allowed all of this to happen. You're allowed to be angry at everyone. What about you? I asked. Are you angry? I was, Nathan said. For a long time. But anger is exhausting. It takes too much energy to maintain. What I am now is committed. I'm committed to making sure that people like Richard Hartwell face consequences. I'm committed to making sure that the people they've harmed get justice. And what about what they harm when they're exposed? I asked. My mother is devastated. My brother is struggling. My entire extended family is dealing with the fallout. Are they considered collateral damage in your quest for justice? Nathan didn't have a good answer to that. Around the same time, things started happening that Nathan hadn't anticipated. Priya, my biological mother, decided to come forward publicly. She gave interviews to major news outlets. She talked about what had happened to her, about how Richard had blackmailed her, about the child she'd lost. She also talked about me. My daughter is the brave one in this situation, she said in one interview that went viral. She was used as a pawn in a man's game of control. And now, as an adult, she's choosing to face the truth. She's choosing to hold her father accountable. That takes courage. I watched that interview in the rental house alone. And I cried. Not because I felt brave. I felt the opposite of brave. I felt like I was drowning in a situation that had spiraled far beyond my control. But seeing my biological mother speak about me, defend me, acknowledge me, that broke something open inside me. Nathan offered to set up a meeting between us. I said yes, even though I was terrified. We met in a neutral location, a coffee shop in a small town where neither of us had connections. Nathan dropped me off and said he'd wait in the car, giving us privacy. Priya looked nothing like I expected. She was smaller than I'd imagined. Older. Her hair had gone gray. Her hands shook as she sat down across from me. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Neither do I replied. We sat in silence for several minutes. I'm sorry, she said finally. I'm sorry that I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry that I let your father take you away. I'm sorry that it took this long for you to know the truth. You didn't have a choice, I said. He threatened you. I should have fought harder, Priya said. I should have risked everything to keep you. But I was young. I was terrified. And he convinced me that if I fought, he would destroy me. That you would grow up knowing I was a failure, a woman who couldn't protect her own child. So I accepted the money. I left. I tried to disappear. But you didn't disappear, I said. You kept searching for me. For 23 years, Priya confirmed. Every birthday, I thought about you. Every holiday, I wondered what you were doing, who you'd become. And then this journalist started asking questions about what happened. And suddenly, there was hope. Suddenly, there was a possibility that I could know you again. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was smaller than mine, and it was shaking. I'm here now, I said. I'm finally here. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about her life, about the struggles she'd faced, about the biological siblings I didn't know I had. We talked about my childhood, about the years I'd spent not knowing her. We talked about my father, about the man he was versus the man I'd thought he was. When we finally said goodbye, she pulled me into a hug. And I felt something inside me shift. Some part of me that had been broken was beginning to heal. But another part of me was becoming increasingly unstable. The stress was catching up with me. I was having panic attacks in the middle of the night. I was barely sleeping. I was existing in a state of constant anxiety, waiting for the next revelation, the next betrayal, the next piece of evidence that would destabilize my reality even further. Nathan kept pushing the investigation forward. More stories broke. More evidence emerged. More people from Richard's past came forward with their own stories of deception and manipulation. But there was something I was beginning to suspect. Something that made me deeply uncomfortable. Nathan was enjoying this. He was enjoying the exposure. He was enjoying the destruction of Richard Hartwell's life. And I was beginning to wonder if my welfare had ever actually been his primary concern. One evening, I confronted him about it. "You're using me," I said bluntly. "You've been using me this entire time. My story, my pain, it's just the vehicle for your revenge." "That's not fair," Nathan said, but his response was defensive in a way that confirmed my suspicion. "Isn't it?" I asked. "You approached me at my workplace. You didn't give me time to process anything. You pushed me into cooperation with your investigation before I even understood what was happening. And now you're pushing me to go further, to do more, to help you take down my father in increasingly public ways." "Because it's the right thing to do," Nathan argued. "Because your father is a murderer and a thief, and he deserves to face consequences." "Maybe," I said. "But I'm not sure anymore that your motivations are entirely about justice. I think they're also about revenge. And I'm not willing to be the instrument of your revenge anymore." Nathan's expression hardened. "If you stop cooperating, everything falls apart," he said coldly. "Without your testimony, without your willingness to come forward, the prosecution's case becomes significantly weaker. Your father's lawyers will argue that I've orchestrated this entire thing, that I've manipulated you, that the evidence is biased." "Maybe they'd be right," I said quietly. "You don't believe that," Nathan said. "You know the truth. You know what your father did." "I do know that," I said. "But I'm also beginning to understand that the truth is more complicated than I thought. And I'm not sure I'm willing to destroy myself completely in the process of exposing it." That's when everything changed. That's when Nathan showed me what he'd been gathering all along. He had recordings, audio files, conversations between Richard and his lawyers, conversations between Richard and my mother, conversations between Richard and people I didn't recognize, people who seemed to be facilitating his escape. Because that's what was happening. Richard was planning to disappear. He'd been quietly liquidating assets. He'd been moving money to accounts that couldn't be traced. He'd been preparing documents that would allow him to establish a new identity in a country without extradition treaties. He was going to run. And if he did, the prosecution's case would collapse. Without Richard present to face charges, the entire investigation would stall. Nathan showed me all of this evidence, and his message was clear. "You need to stay in this fight. You need to help me make sure he can't escape." I looked at the evidence. I looked at Nathan's expression. And I realized the trap I was in. I was no longer choosing to pursue justice. I was being coerced into it. I was being manipulated by someone who claimed to be helping me, but who was actually using my compliance to accomplish his own goals. And the worst part was knowing that he wasn't entirely wrong. My father did need to face consequences. He did need to be held accountable. But at what cost? And to whom? I made a decision that night. I decided to stop trusting Nathan completely. Not because I thought he was lying about the evidence. The recordings were real. The financial trails were real. Richard's escape plan was real. But Nathan's motivations had become muddied, and I couldn't afford to be guided by someone whose primary goal was revenge rather than my welfare. So I started keeping things from him. I began secretly meeting with a lawyer, not one connected to my father's firm or Nathan's investigation. Someone neutral. Someone who could advise me on my legal position, my rights, what I was actually obligated to do versus what I was being pressured to do. Her name was Victoria Chin, and she was the first person in months who looked at me and asked, "What do you actually want?" No one had asked me that in a long time. "I want this to be over," I said honestly. "I want to know who I am. I want to know my biological family. I want my father to face consequences. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life fighting. I don't want to be defined by this trauma." "Then we need to protect you," Victoria said. "That means establishing clear boundaries about what you will and won't do moving forward." I took her advice. I told Nathan that I would cooperate with the prosecution to the extent required by law, but I would not participate in any further media coverage. I would not continue to serve as his primary witness or his public face for the investigation. Nathan's reaction was immediate and explosive. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly. "You're letting your father manipulate you even now. He's probably had his lawyers reach out to you, hasn't he? Trying to convince you that cooperation would be beneficial." "My father hasn't contacted me," I said. "But my lawyer has explained my options. And my option is to step back." "If you step back, he escapes," Nathan said. "You understand that, right? Your father will disappear, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that you had the power to stop him and you chose not to." "Maybe," I said. "But I'd rather live with that than live with the knowledge that I destroyed my entire family out of anger and revenge." "It's not revenge," Nathan said. "It's justice." "It's both," I replied. "And I'm not willing to pay the price anymore." Nathan left the rental house that evening. He said he had work to do on the story. He said he understood my position even though he disagreed with it. He said he'd check on me in a few days. He never came back. What he did instead was publish another story. This one was about me. Specifically, about my cooperation with his investigation and what he framed as my sudden change of heart. He quoted anonymous sources, people he claimed were connected to the prosecution, saying that I was becoming an unreliable witness. He suggested that I was being manipulated by my father's legal team. He implied that my decision to step back was evidence of their influence. The story was designed to pressure me back into full cooperation. It worked in ways I didn't expect. My phone exploded with calls and messages. Reporters wanted to know if the allegations in Nathan's story were true. Prosecutors called Victoria asking if I was planning to recant my testimony. My biological mother called, worried and confused about why I was pulling back. And then I got a call from my father's lawyer. "Your father would like to propose a deal," the lawyer said. His name was Douglas Fleming, and he represented the kind of wealth and power that could make problems disappear if you were willing to pay for it. "I'm listening," I said, though I knew I probably shouldn't be. "Your father acknowledges that mistakes were made," Fleming continued. "Serious mistakes with serious consequences. He's willing to accept a plea agreement that includes a significant prison sentence. He's willing to make restitution to the victims of his financial crimes. What he needs in return is for you to stop cooperating with the media and to avoid making additional public statements about what happened." "He wants me to disappear," I said flatly. "He wants to protect his remaining family," Fleming corrected. "Your mother is struggling with the public nature of these accusations. Your brother is having difficulty at school because of the media attention. Your father believes that if the spotlight shifts away from the family, healing can begin." I wanted to hang up, but I also wanted to understand what he was offering. "What about the murder investigation?" I asked. "What about Ashok Kapoor?" "That will proceed independently of your involvement," Fleming said. "The prosecution has sufficient evidence from other sources. Your cooperation is valuable, but not essential." That wasn't true. Victoria had explained to me that my testimony was actually crucial to the prosecution's case. Without me, there were gaps in the narrative. There were moments when the evidence required interpretation, and my lived experience provided that interpretation. But I understood what Fleming was really saying. My father was willing to accept significant consequences if it meant silencing me. I told Fleming I would consider it. That evening, I met with Victoria again. "He's trying to manipulate you," Victoria said. "This is a classic intimidation tactic. He's saying, cooperate and destroy your family, or step back and we'll accept the consequences. He's trying to make you feel responsible for your family's suffering." "But I am responsible," I said. "I made the choice to come forward. I made the choice to cooperate with Nathan. All of this, my mother's pain, my brother's struggles, my father's legal situation, that's all a result of my choices." "No," Victoria said firmly. "All of this is a result of your father's choices. He murdered someone. He embezzled from clients. He used you as a tool of control. He's responsible for his own consequences. You didn't make him do any of those things. But I could choose not to testify, I said. I could choose to step back, and it would ease their suffering. It would delay their suffering, Victoria corrected. It would not eliminate it. And it would ensure that your father's crimes go unpunished, which means he could potentially commit similar crimes in the future. I knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two different things. That night, I made the mistake of answering when my mother called. Please, she said without preamble. Please stop this. Please stop cooperating with that journalist. Your father made mistakes, but he's still your father. He still loves you. He used me, I said quietly. He was trying to protect us, my mother replied. He was trying to keep our family safe. Yes, he broke laws. Yes, he did terrible things. But he did them because he was desperate. Because he was afraid. He murdered someone, I said. He used me as blackmail. He lied to me my entire life. I know, my mother said, and her voice broke. I know all of that. But I'm still your mother. And I'm asking you, as your mother, to consider what this crusade is costing us. Thomas is having panic attacks. His therapist says he's showing signs of severe depression. I'm on medication to sleep. Your father is facing federal charges and a murder investigation. How much more punishment does our family need to endure? I couldn't answer her. I never wanted this, she continued. I never wanted you to know about any of this. Your father kept it from me for years. When I finally found out, I was devastated. I wanted to turn him in. But he convinced me that it would destroy the family. That it would destroy you. So I accepted his version of events. I accepted the lie because I thought it was protecting you. It wasn't protecting me, I said. It was protecting him. I know that now, my mother said. And I have to live with that knowledge. Just like you have to live with yours. But please, Evelyn, consider what you're doing. Consider the cost. I hung up after that. I couldn't have that conversation without falling apart. The next morning, I woke up to find that Nathan had published a follow-up story. This one was about my biological mother, Priya. It included details about her life after Richard took me away. It included information about her struggle with mental illness, the result of the trauma and stress of losing her child and her husband. It included quotes from her therapist, confidential information that should never have been made public, discussing her struggles with depression and suicidal ideation. The implication was clear. My biological mother's suffering was also part of the cost of staying silent. Nathan was weaponizing everyone around me. My adoptive family's suffering if I continued to cooperate. My biological mother's suffering if I didn't. He was creating a situation where no matter what choice I made, someone would be devastated. I called him immediately. What the hell were you thinking? I demanded. I was thinking that you needed to understand the full scope of what your father's actions have caused, Nathan said calmly. I was thinking that you needed to see clearly that silence isn't mercy. Silence is complicity. You violated my mother's medical privacy, I said. You used her trauma as a weapon against me. I used the truth, Nathan corrected. The same truth you asked me to expose. I asked you to expose my father's crimes, I said. Not to weaponize everyone around me. That's naive, Nathan said. Exposing crimes means exposing collateral damage. It means showing the full scope of harm. Your father didn't just hurt you. He hurt everyone connected to him. Everyone should understand that. Everyone? I asked. Or just the people you want to hurt? Because it seems to me like you're using this investigation as an excuse to destroy my entire family, and you're using me as the justification for doing it. Your family is already destroyed, Nathan said flatly. Your father destroyed it when he murdered Ashok Kapoor. I'm just exposing what's already broken. I hung up. That afternoon, I made an appointment with Victoria. I told her I wanted to know if there was any legal way I could step back from the investigation without completely destroying the prosecution's case. There isn't, Victoria said. Your testimony is crucial. Without you, the narrative falls apart in critical ways. The prosecution will be significantly weakened. Even if I'm not a reliable witness? I asked, referencing Nathan's story. You're a reliable witness, Victoria said. That story was designed to discredit you. It was designed to make you doubt yourself. But the facts of your testimony are solid. You lived through the events you're describing. No amount of media manipulation changes that. Then I'm trapped, I said. If I testify, I destroy my family. If I don't testify, I allow my father to escape justice. That's what your father is hoping you believe, Victoria said. But it's not actually true. The prosecution has other evidence. Other witnesses. Your testimony is important, but it's not the only piece of the puzzle. Then why is Nathan pushing me so hard? I asked. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Because your story is more compelling than the financial documents, she said finally. Because a father murdering his daughter's biological father and then using that daughter as blackmail is a narrative that sells. Because Nathan Cross has built his entire career on your story, and he needs you to stay invested in order to maintain his professional momentum. So he's using me, I said. He was, Victoria agreed. But you have agency here. You have choices. The question is, what do you actually want? That's when I made a decision that changed everything. I called the prosecution and told them I would testify, but only at trial. I would not participate in any pretrial publicity. I would not give interviews. I would not make public statements. My cooperation would be limited to providing testimony under oath in a courtroom, where my words would be subject to cross-examination and legal scrutiny. The prosecutors weren't happy about it, but they accepted the terms. I also sent a cease and desist letter to Nathan, warning him that if he published any more information about me or my family without explicit written consent, I would pursue legal action. And then I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I agreed to meet with my father. Victoria advised against it. She said it was too risky. She said he might try to intimidate me into recanting my testimony. She said it could complicate the prosecution's case. But I needed to see him. I needed to look him in the eye and understand how a man could do what he'd done and still claim to love his daughter. We met in a conference room at the courthouse, with Victoria present and my father's lawyer, Douglas Fleming, also in attendance. Richard looked diminished. He'd aged 10 years in the weeks since the stories broke. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water glass in front of him. I don't expect your forgiveness, he said immediately. I don't expect understanding. I just want you to know that everything I did because I was terrified. Because I'd made mistakes and I was desperate to protect my family from the consequences. You murdered someone, I said flatly. Yes, Richard acknowledged. I did. And I've had to live with that knowledge for 23 years. Do you know what that's like? Carrying the weight of someone's death? Of knowing that your actions led to someone's destruction. You could have turned yourself in, I said. You could have faced justice. I could have, Richard agreed. But then I would have destroyed your life, your mother's life, Thomas's life. I convinced myself that my silence was protecting you. It wasn't protecting me, I said. It was using me. Richard flinched at that. For a moment, something genuine flickered across his face. Something that looked like actual remorse. I know, he said quietly. I've had a lot of time to understand that. And I don't know how to apologize for something so fundamental, so destructive. I used you as a tool. I treated you as property instead of a person. I lied to you about everything. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I want you to understand that this wasn't about you, Richard said. Your pain was necessary to my survival, but it wasn't the goal. The goal was always to protect myself. And in doing that, I destroyed you. And now? I asked. What do you want now? Now I want to face what I've done, Richard said. I'm going to accept the plea agreement. I'm going to serve the sentence. I'm going to make what restitution I can. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life knowing that I caused immeasurable harm to people who loved me. For the first time since the investigation began, I saw my father as he actually was, not a monster, but a flawed man who'd made catastrophic choices and was finally beginning to understand the weight of those choices. It didn't change what he'd done. It didn't undo any of the harm. But it did something I didn't expect. It made the situation more complicated. Because hating him was easier than this. Hating him meant I could justify everything, the public exposure, the destruction of my family, the media circus. But seeing him genuinely confronting what he'd done, seeing him understand the scope of his crimes, that required a more nuanced response. That required me to accept that justice and compassion are not mutually exclusive. That holding someone accountable and acknowledging their humanity are not contradictory positions. And that realization cracked something open inside me that I wasn't prepared for. The meeting with my father was supposed to bring clarity. Instead, it brought confusion that spread through my life like poison through water. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I existed in a state of suspended animation, caught between competing truths that couldn't coexist. My father was a murderer. And he was remorseful. He'd destroyed lives. And he was finally accepting responsibility. He'd used me as a weapon. And he seemed to genuinely understand the harm he'd caused. These things were all true simultaneously, and my mind couldn't reconcile them. Victoria noticed I was deteriorating. "You need to step back," she said during one of our sessions. "You need to take care of yourself before the trial. You're no good to anyone if you're this emotionally unstable." But stepping back wasn't an option. The prosecution needed trial preparation. I had to go through depositions, review evidence, prepare testimony. There was no break available, no time to process what was happening. Then my mother tried to kill herself. I found out through a call from my brother Thomas. He was crying so hard I could barely understand what he was saying. The words eventually came through: overdose, ambulance, hospital, unconscious, uncertain prognosis. I drove to the hospital in a state of autopilot. I don't remember the drive. I just remember arriving at the psychiatric ward and finding my mother in an intensive care unit, hooked to machines, her stomach having been pumped, her body failing as a result of her own deliberate action. She'd left a note, Thomas told me. It explained that she couldn't live with what she knew, that she couldn't survive the public humiliation, that she'd been prescribed anxiety medication and sleep aids, and she decided that combining them was her way of escaping the unbearable reality of her life. The note didn't mention me directly, but it was addressed to my father. It said, "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I couldn't keep your secret. I'm sorry I failed as a wife and as a mother." She didn't write that she was sorry for her failures as a parent. She wrote that she was sorry for her failures to my father. She'd internalized his crimes as her own responsibility to manage. I sat in the waiting room of that hospital, and I felt something inside me break completely. Nathan called while I was there. "I heard about your mother," he said without preamble. "I'm sorry. That's a difficult situation." "Is it?" I asked coldly. "Did you know this would happen? Is that why you published that story about her mental health? Did you want to push her toward this?" "I wanted to show the truth," Nathan said. "I wanted people to understand the scope of harm your father's actions have caused." "And now she's tried to die," I said. "Is this the scope of harm you wanted to expose? Is my mother's suicide attempt the story you were looking for?" "Your mother made her own choices," Nathan said. "Just like you made yours. Just like your father made his. I'm not responsible for her mental state. You published private medical information about her," I said. "You made her pain public entertainment. And now you're telling me you're not responsible for the consequences." "I'm responsible for telling the truth," Nathan said. "What people do with that truth is their responsibility." I hung up. When my mother regained consciousness 2 days later, the first thing she said to me was, "I'm sorry." She was hooked to oxygen and 4 lines, and the first thing out of her mouth was an apology. "You have nothing to apologize for," I said, taking her hand. I abandoned you, she said, her voice hoarse. Not by adoption. By complicity. By choosing your father's version of events over your reality. By raising you in a lie. I know, I said. But you were also trapped. You were manipulated and threatened just like I was. That doesn't excuse what I did, my mother said. It doesn't undo the harm. I was your mother, and I failed to protect you. And when I found out what your father had done, I prioritized my marriage over my daughter. I chose to believe his version of events rather than face the truth. Why? I asked. Because the truth was terrifying, my mother said. The truth meant that everything I'd built my life on was a lie. The truth meant that I'd raised a child in false circumstances. The truth meant that I was complicit in crimes I didn't commit but knew about. The truth was too big, and I didn't have the strength to face it. She started crying, and I held her hand while she did. The hospital psychiatrist told me that my mother was experiencing severe trauma and depression, that she would need long-term treatment, that she should not be left alone, that her suicide risk remained elevated even after the immediate crisis passed. My mother had been destroyed by my father's choices and then redestroyed by my cooperation with the investigation. I couldn't escape the knowledge that my pursuit of justice had contributed to her breakdown. Things with Thomas got worse after that. My 17-year-old brother was struggling at school. He'd been bullied by other students, had missed significant class time, and was on the verge of not graduating. He was also angry. Angry at our father for committing crimes. Angry at me for exposing those crimes. Angry at our mother for not protecting us from either of those things. When I went to visit him at his school, he refused to see me. You destroyed this family, he said through a text message I found on my phone. You chose a stranger over your own blood. I'll never forgive you for that. I wanted to explain to him that I hadn't chosen between family and a stranger. I'd chosen between silence and truth. But he wasn't ready to hear that distinction. My adoptive father's law firm fell apart. Partners who'd worked with him for decades abandoned him. Clients filed lawsuits for fraudulent representation. The firm's reputation, built over 40 years, crumbled in a matter of weeks. Douglas Fleming, my father's lawyer, told me during a deposition that Richard was likely to face significant prison time. Probably 15 to 20 years, potentially more depending on how the murder charges were handled. 15 to 20 years. That meant my father would likely die in prison. That meant my brother would grow up without his father. That meant my mother's marriage was effectively over. And all of it traced back to my decision to cooperate with Nathan's investigation. I spiraled. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering calls from Victoria. I stopped everything except sitting in the rental house and staring at walls, wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. Victoria finally came to the house in person. She let herself in with a key Nathan had given her, and she found me in the bedroom, lying in the dark. You're having a breakdown, Victoria said bluntly. And I'm not going to pretend this is surprising. You've been carrying an impossible weight for months. My mother tried to kill herself, I said. My brother won't speak to me. My father is facing decades in prison. My adoptive family is destroyed. Yes, Victoria said. All of that is true. And all of it is a result of your father's choices, not your choices. But I exposed him, I said. I cooperated with the investigation. I made the decision to go public. You made the decision to tell the truth, Victoria corrected. Your father made the decision to commit murder. Your father made the decision to embezzle. Your father made the decision to use you as blackmail. You are not responsible for his actions or their consequences. But my family is experiencing the natural consequences of your father's crimes, Victoria interrupted. Your mother is struggling because she's been forced to confront the reality of her marriage. Your brother is struggling because his father is facing prison. These are painful realities, but they are realities that existed before you exposed them. You didn't create them. You just revealed them. What if I hadn't? I asked. What if I'd accepted the deal your father offered? What if I'd stepped back? Your father would still be facing prosecution, Victoria said. The evidence would still exist. The truth would still be true. But it would be hidden, and the people it hurt would continue suffering in silence. Is that actually better? I didn't answer. I'm going to say something that might be difficult to hear, Victoria continued. Your family is broken. But your family was broken before this. It was held together by lies and secrets and coercion. What you're seeing now isn't a family falling apart. It's a family revealing itself as broken. And that pain, as terrible as it is also the beginning of healing. My mother tried to kill herself, I repeated. And now she's getting psychiatric help, Victoria said. And now she's beginning to process her own trauma instead of compartmentalizing it. That's painful, but it's also necessary. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that all of this suffering served a purpose. But in that moment, I couldn't see any purpose at all. I could only see destruction. That night, I attempted what my mother had attempted. I didn't plan it carefully like she had. I didn't leave a note. I just took a bottle of sleeping pills and consumed half of them before Victoria found me. She called emergency services. I was hospitalized. I had my stomach pumped. I woke up on a psychiatric hold in the same hospital where my mother was recovering. My mother was the first person to visit me after I regained consciousness. She looked at me from the doorway of my hospital room, and she started crying. Don't do this, she said, coming to hold my hand. Please don't follow me down this path. Why not? I asked. I destroyed our family. I exposed your husband. I caused all of this suffering. You did what you had to do, my mother said. And yes, it's painful. And yes, there are consequences. But suicide isn't the answer. Death isn't the answer. The answer is surviving this. It's moving through this pain and finding meaning on the other side. I don't believe there's meaning, I said. I think I just destroyed everything for no reason. No, my mother said firmly. You exposed the truth. That has meaning, even if you can't see it yet. I was hospitalized for 2 weeks. During that time, I was evaluated by psychiatrists who diagnosed me with severe depression, complex PTSD, and anxiety disorder. I was prescribed medication. I was put in therapy. I was gradually moved back toward a place where I could function. But I wasn't moved back toward a place where I could testify. My lawyer, Victoria, met with me in the hospital. The prosecution is concerned, she said. They're wondering if you're still able to testify. They're wondering if a defense attorney could use your psychiatric hospitalization to undermine your credibility. Maybe they should find another witness, I said flatly. Maybe my testimony would do more harm than good at this point. That's for you to decide, Victoria said. But I want to be clear about what that decision would mean. Without your testimony, the prosecution's case becomes significantly weaker. Your father's defense team will argue that the evidence is circumstantial. They'll argue that the recordings could have been doctored. They'll argue that the financial records don't prove criminal intent. Your testimony is what ties all the pieces together. Without you, the pieces fall apart. Then maybe they should fall apart, I said. Maybe my father deserves to walk free if the cost of his conviction is the destruction of everyone around him. Your father doesn't walk free, Victoria said. He still faces the murder charges. He still faces the embezzlement charges. The evidence is still there. What changes is that justice becomes less certain. What changes is that your biological father's murder remains less clearly avenged. Maybe that's okay, I said. Victoria left the hospital that day looking deeply concerned. The prosecution, through their assistant district attorney, filed a motion requesting that I be evaluated to determine if I was competent to testify. The motion was based on my psychiatric hospitalization and my suicide attempt. My defense attorney, Victoria, filed a counter-motion arguing that I was competent and that my hospitalization should not be used to discredit my testimony. The judge scheduled a competency hearing for 2 weeks later. And suddenly, the focus shifted. Instead of whether my father's crimes were real, The question became whether I was mentally stable enough to describe those crimes in public. Instead of justice, the conversation became about my sanity. I was released from the psychiatric hospital on a Tuesday morning with a prescription bottle and a stack of therapy appointments I didn't believe I would keep. Victoria picked me up. She drove me to a coffee shop instead of back to the rental house. She ordered me food I didn't want and sat across from me with an expression that suggested she had something important to say. "The competency hearing is in 1 week," she said. "The prosecution is going to argue that your psychiatric episode demonstrates you're mentally unstable and unreliable. The defense is going to argue the same thing. Both sides are going to use your breakdown as evidence of unfitness." "Then I'm unfit," I said. "That solves the problem. I don't testify, my father's case weakens, and I can try to rebuild my life." "That's not rebuilding," Victoria said. "That's surrendering. And before you make that choice, I want you to meet someone." She didn't wait for my response. She texted someone, and 5 minutes later, a woman walked into the coffee shop. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and a physical presence that suggested someone who'd survived significant hardship and come out the other side stronger. "This is Margaret Sullivan," Victoria said. "She's a survivor of embezzlement by a partner in her business. She's also someone who testified in a high-profile case against that partner while dealing with her own depression and anxiety." Margaret sat down without asking permission. She ordered coffee and looked at me directly. "I'm going to tell you something that people don't want to hear," Margaret said. "Trauma doesn't make you weak. It makes you qualified to speak about the truth of what happened. The defense is going to try to use your psychiatric hospitalization against you. They're going to try to convince you that your pain makes you unreliable. But here's what I learned. My pain made me credible. My pain made it clear that I understood the full scope of what that man had done to me." "You testified?" I asked. "I testified," Margaret confirmed. "And I was terrified. I was on medication. I'd had panic attacks in the courtroom. I'd cried on the stand. And you know what? The jury believed me. Because credibility isn't about perfection. It's about authenticity. And I was authentic." "But your breakdown," I said. "Didn't it make it easier for the defense to discredit you?" "It did initially," Margaret said. "But what actually happened was that the jury saw a person who'd been deeply harmed speaking about her experience. And they understood that my mental health struggles were a result of the trauma, not a reason to doubt my account of what actually happened." I wanted to believe her. But I'd heard enough courtroom narratives to know that juries could be unpredictable. "Here's what I want you to understand," Margaret continued. "The defense is betting that you'll be broken enough to not testify, or that you'll be so broken that your testimony will be easily discredited. But there's a third option. You can be broken and still be powerful. You can have survived a suicide attempt and still speak truth. You can be in therapy and still be credible." She gave me her phone number before she left. She told me to call her if I needed to talk to someone who understood. After she left, Victoria said, "That's your choice. You can pretend none of this happened. Or you can testify from a place of authentic damage. From a place of someone who understands exactly what her father's actions have cost." I went back to the rental house that day and thought about what Margaret had said. For months, I'd been operating under the assumption that I needed to be healed to be effective, that I needed to have processed my trauma and emerged stronger before I could speak about it. But Margaret was suggesting something different. She was suggesting that my trauma, my pain, my breakdown, these were actually evidence that I understood what had happened. These were proof of impact. I called Margaret that evening. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about her embezzlement case. She told me about the moment she decided to testify despite her fear. She told me about the defense attorney's aggressive cross-examination and how she'd held her ground. She told me about the conviction and what it felt like to see justice served. "The thing nobody tells you," Margaret said, "is that testifying doesn't heal you. It doesn't make the trauma go away. But it does something else. It gives your trauma meaning. It transforms your pain into purpose. What if I'm not ready? I asked. You'll never be ready, Margaret said. Ready is a fiction we tell ourselves. What matters is whether you're willing. The competency hearing happened on a Thursday morning. The prosecution's expert testified that while I was experiencing significant depression and anxiety, I was mentally competent to testify. I understood the difference between truth and falsity. I had the capacity to recall events. I understood the obligation to tell the truth under oath. The defense's expert testified that while I might technically be competent, my psychiatric episode suggested that I was unreliable as a witness, that my judgment was compromised, that my emotional state made me susceptible to suggestion and manipulation. Then the judge called me to the witness stand. I walked up there with Victoria's voice in my head. You can be broken and still be powerful. The judge asked me directly, Ms. Hartwell, do you understand the nature of this proceeding? Do you understand that you're being asked to testify about traumatic events? Yes, I said. I understand. Are you willing to testify despite your recent psychiatric hospitalization? The judge asked. I thought about my biological father, Ashok, murdered by my adoptive father's hand. I thought about my biological mother, Priya, losing her daughter and spending 23 years searching for me. I thought about the other victims of my father's embezzlement. I thought about everyone who'd been harmed by his crimes and his cover-ups. I'm willing, I said. The judge ruled that I was competent to testify. The trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, I prepared with Victoria and the prosecution. I went through my testimony multiple times. I prepared myself for the defense attorney's cross-examination. I memorized details. I organized my thoughts. But the most important preparation happened in a different way. I went to visit my biological mother, Priya, in her home for the first time. She was living in a small apartment with my 2 half-siblings, a brother named Ravi and a sister named Asha. They were both younger than me, born after my biological father's death, born to a different man who'd been kind enough to raise them as his own. When I walked into that apartment, Priya started crying immediately. I wanted to do this so many times, she said, pulling me into an embrace. I wanted to show you the life you would have had, the siblings you should have known. But I couldn't. I was too afraid. My siblings were cautious around me initially. I was a stranger who shared their mother's face, but I was also a stranger who'd grown up in the family that had stolen their sister away. But over the course of the evening, something shifted. Ravi, my half-brother who was 20, said to me, "Thank you for testifying. Thank you for being willing to face this. Our father deserves justice, even if it comes 23 years late." Asha, my half-sister who was 19, hugged me and said, "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we finally get to know you." Sitting in that apartment with my biological family, I felt something click into place inside me. This was what I'd been fighting for. Not just to expose my father's crimes, but to reclaim my actual identity, to know these people, to be known by them. I called Victoria that night. "I'm ready to testify," I said. Not because I'm healed, not because I've moved past what happened, but because my testimony matters, because it honors the people who've been harmed, because it gives my pain purpose. "Good," Victoria said. "That's exactly the perspective you need to carry into that courtroom." The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The cave where I'd been left, the little boy who'd seen it, the years of lies, the investigation, the destruction of my family, my mother's suicide attempt, my own breakdown. I thought about how Nathan had used me and how that use had still resulted in something meaningful. I thought about how my father's crimes had been so devastating that they'd forced the truth into the open, whether anyone was ready for it or not. I thought about the choice I'd made to testify. I thought about what that choice would cost and what it might accomplish. And I made peace with the fact that I couldn't control the outcome. I could only control my willingness to speak the truth. That night, I finally slept. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I'd imagined something grand and imposing, the kind of space where justice would feel monumental. Instead, it was a functional room with beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and wooden furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. The trial had already been going on for a week. The prosecution had presented their case methodically. Financial experts had testified about the embezzlement. Police investigators had testified about the murder investigation. Medical examiners had testified about the cause of Ashok Kapoor's death. Now it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand with Victoria's words echoing in my mind. "You are broken and powerful simultaneously." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chin, approached me with a folder of documents and photographs. "Ms. Hartwell," she began, "can you state your full legal name for the record?" "Evelyn Margaret Hartwell," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. "And is that the name you were given at birth?" Sarah asked. "No," I said. "I was born with a different name. I was adopted when I was 18 months old by Richard and Margaret Hartwell." "And when did you learn that your adoption may not have been a standard adoption?" Sarah asked. I took a breath. "When I was 23 years old," I began. "My adoptive father called me into his study and told me that I had been found in a remote location when I was 18 months old. He told me that my biological family couldn't care for me. He told me that I should never ask questions about my past because it would only bring pain." Sarah walked me through the events methodically. The phone call I'd overheard. The warning from my father about people who would try to contact me. The letter from my biological mother. The meeting with Nathan Cross. She asked me to describe Nathan's evidence. The police reports. The medical records. The audio recordings. I described them in detail, my voice steady even as my hands trembled slightly. "And when you listened to the audio recording of your biological mother," Sarah asked, "what did you hear her saying?" "She was terrified," I said. "She was explaining to a police officer that my father, Richard Hartwell, had murdered her husband, Ashok Kapoor, because he discovered evidence of financial crimes. She was explaining that Richard had taken me away from her and was threatening to keep me from her if she ever spoke about what happened." The courtroom was completely silent. "Miss Hartwell," Sarah continued, "did you ever have a conversation with your adoptive father about why you were adopted?" "Yes," I said. "Multiple conversations. He told me that I should be grateful. That he and my mother had saved me from a life of abandonment and neglect. He told me that my biological mother had given me up because she couldn't care for me. He told me that I owed them loyalty because they'd given me everything." "Did he ever explain the actual circumstances of your adoption?" Sarah asked. "Not until I cooperated with the investigation," I said. "When I confronted him about what I'd learned, he admitted that I had been taken from my biological mother as leverage to ensure her silence about my father's crimes." I watched my father in the gallery. He was wearing an expensive suit and had his face arranged in an expression of concerned resignation. But I could see his hands clenching and unclenching beneath the table. Sarah walked me through my father's confession to me. His admission that he'd used me as blackmail. His acknowledgement that he'd lied to me about my entire identity. She showed me photographs of the cave where I'd been left. She showed me medical records from the hospital where I'd been admitted after being found. She showed me adoption documents with false signatures. Each document was another piece of evidence that my entire childhood had been built on lies and murder. Then it was time for cross-examination. My father's defense attorney was a man named Harold Chambers. He was in his 70s, with white hair and the demeanor of someone who'd been winning cases for decades. He approached me with a gentle expression that felt deeply threatening. "Miss Hartwell," he began, "you mentioned that you were hospitalized recently for psychiatric reasons. Is that correct?" "Yes," I said. I'd known this was coming. "And the reason for that hospitalization was a suicide attempt?" Harold asked. "Yes," I said again. "And you're currently on multiple psychiatric medications," he continued. Yes. And you attempted suicide because you were distressed about the impact of this investigation on your family? Harold asked. I was distressed about multiple factors, I said carefully. My father's crimes were devastating. Learning the truth was devastating. The impact on my family was devastating. All of those things contributed to my breakdown. So your mental state is directly connected to the investigation that led you to testify today, Harold said. It wasn't a question. My mental state is connected to the reality of what my father did, I corrected. The investigation simply made that reality impossible to ignore. Harold shifted tactics. You mentioned that you met with a journalist named Nathan Cross, who provided you with evidence against your father, Harold said. Did Mr. Cross have any personal motivation to expose your father? Yes, I acknowledged. He believed my father may have been responsible for his father's death. So Mr. Cross was pursuing a personal vendetta, Harold suggested. And you were the vehicle for that vendetta. Nathan's motivations were complicated, I said. But that doesn't change the fact that the evidence he provided was accurate. Is it accurate? Harold challenged. Or is it evidence that was carefully selected and presented to support a predetermined narrative? Victoria had prepared me for this. She'd told me that the defense would try to discredit the evidence by suggesting it had been manipulated or curated. All the evidence I've testified about has been verified by independent sources, I said. The police reports are official documents. The medical records are from the hospital. The audio recordings have been authenticated by forensic audio experts. But you trusted Mr. Cross's presentation of that evidence without independent verification, Harold said. Isn't that correct? I trusted the evidence itself, I said. Not Mr. Cross's motives for presenting it. Harold walked me through my adoption documents. He suggested that they might have been legitimate, that I might have simply misunderstood the circumstances. He suggested that my biological mother might have actually abandoned me, and that my father had simply been honest about the origin of my adoption. But I had the medical records. I had the evidence of abandonment that had been documented by hospital staff. I had the audio recording of my biological mother describing her grief over losing me. Your Honor, I said at one point, I have to clarify something. I understand that Mr. Chambers is trying to create doubt about what happened. But I have lived the reality of what happened. I have met my biological mother. I have seen her pain. I have learned about the life I should have had. And I know with absolute certainty that I was not abandoned by her. I was taken from her. The courtroom was silent. Harold moved on to questioning my memory. He suggested that details might be confused. He suggested that I might be misremembering conversations. He suggested that my traumatized state might be affecting my ability to accurately recall events. But I'd lived through these events. I'd been there for every important moment. And I had corroboration from multiple sources. When Harold finally finished his cross-examination, I felt hollowed out but intact. The prosecution called additional witnesses. Priya testified about losing her daughter and searching for 23 years. She testified about Richard's threats and blackmail. She testified about the trauma of learning that her child had been raised by the man who'd murdered her first husband. Medical experts testified about the evidence of abandonment documented in my hospital records. Financial experts testified about the embezzlement scheme. Forensic audio experts testified that the recordings were authentic and unaltered. Nathan Cross was called as a witness. He testified about his investigation and the evidence he'd uncovered. Under cross-examination, he admitted that his father's suspicious death had motivated his investigation. He admitted that he'd pursued the story partially out of personal vendetta. But that doesn't change the truth, he said on the stand. The evidence is what it is, regardless of my motivations for uncovering it. My father did not testify. His lawyers had advised him against it, and he took their advice. But his confession to me was read into the record by Sarah Chen. She played the recording of our meeting in the courthouse conference room. She played the moment where my father admitted that he'd used me as blackmail. She played his acknowledgement that he'd lied about my entire identity. The jury heard my father's voice admitting to the core of what he'd done. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The closing arguments were powerful. The prosecution painted a narrative of a man who'd committed murder to cover up financial crimes, and who'd then used his adopted daughter as a tool of control to ensure the victim's mother would stay silent. The defense painted a narrative of a desperate man who'd made terrible choices early in his career, and who'd compounded those mistakes by covering them up. They suggested that the adoption may not have been nefarious, that it may have been simply a way to provide a better life for a child who needed one. They suggested that I was an unreliable witness whose mental health issues made me susceptible to suggestion and manipulation. But the jury didn't believe that narrative. After 4 days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Murder in the second degree. Embezzlement. Money laundering. Wire fraud. Falsification of documents. When the verdict was read, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not joy, exactly. Not victory. But something like closure. Something like justice. My father was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He didn't look at me as he passed. He stared straight ahead with an expression I couldn't read. I was exhausted and hollow and relieved all at the same time. Priya was waiting for me outside the courthouse. She pulled me into an embrace while cameras flashed around us. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for your courage." I cried against her shoulder. Months of tension and fear and grief poured out of me in that moment. Later, standing on the courthouse steps with Victoria, Sarah Chin, and members of the prosecution team, a reporter asked me what I was feeling. "I'm feeling grateful," I said. Grateful that the truth came out. Grateful that the people who hurt others are being held accountable. Grateful that I don't have to carry this alone anymore. That evening, I sat with my biological family in my mother's apartment. Priya made a traditional Indian dinner. My siblings helped. We ate together like we'd always known each other. "What happens now?" Ravi asked. "Now I start figuring out who I actually am," I said. Not who my adoptive parents wanted me to be. Not who the trauma made me become. But who I actually am underneath all of that. "And what about your adoptive family?" Asha asked gently. "I don't know," I admitted. "Thomas still won't speak to me. My mother is recovering from her hospitalization. I have to figure out what relationship, if any, I can maintain with them." "That's fair," Priya said. "They hurt you. Deliberately or not, they hurt you. But they also raised me," I said. "They gave me education and safety and stability, even if it was all built on lies. I don't know how to reconcile those things." "You don't have to," Priya said. "You get to feel all of it. Gratitude and anger. Love and betrayal. All of it can coexist." That night, I fell asleep in a safe place surrounded by people who loved me and wanted to know me. For the first time in months, I slept without nightmares. The sentencing hearing happened 6 weeks after the verdict. My father stood before the judge in an orange prison uniform, looking diminished and older than I'd ever seen him. The judge reviewed his crimes. Murder in the second degree carried a sentence of 15 to life. The embezzlement and fraud charges added significant time on top of that. The judge sentenced Richard Hartwell to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. He would be 73 years old before he could possibly be released. He would likely die in prison. I sat in the gallery and felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Just a kind of numb finality. After the sentencing, I met with Richard's lawyer one final time. Douglas Fleming had a check for me. It was from my father's remaining assets. $50,000. His lawyer explained that my father wanted me to have it. That it was his attempt at restitution. I thought about refusing it. But Victoria pointed out that taking it didn't obligate me to forgive him or maintain a relationship with him. It was simply what remained of his estate after his legal fees and his victim settlements. I took the check. That money became the foundation for rebuilding my life. I withdrew from the rental house and moved into an apartment closer to my biological family. It was a modest place, nothing like the comfortable homes I'd grown up in, but it was mine. I decorated it with help from Priya and Asha. I filled it with books and plants and art that reflected who I was becoming rather than who anyone else had wanted me to be. I started therapy with a new psychiatrist, Dr. Morrison, who specialized in complex trauma. We worked on processing everything that had happened. We worked on separating my identity from the adoption narrative. We worked on building a sense of self that existed independent of the lies I'd been told. "Who are you?" Dr. Morrison would ask me regularly, and I would struggle to answer. Because for so long, I'd been defined by what had happened to me rather than by who I actually was. Gradually, through months of therapy, I began to understand myself differently. I was someone who valued truth, even when truth was painful. I was someone who could survive devastation and emerge stronger. I was someone capable of holding complexity, of loving and resenting, of forgiving and remembering, of moving forward while honoring the past. I was someone who'd been through enough that my own suffering no longer felt incomprehensible to me. I could sit with other people's pain without trying to fix it or minimize it. I returned to work 3 months after the trial ended. My employer had kept my position open, and my coworkers were supportive without being patronizing. I rebuilt professional relationships. I proved that I was capable and reliable despite everything that had happened. But I knew I couldn't stay in marketing forever. 6 months after the verdict, I made a decision that shocked everyone who knew me. I went back to school. I enrolled in a journalism program at a local university. I told my family that I wanted to tell stories. Stories about people who'd survived trauma. Stories about systems that failed vulnerable people. Stories about the cost of secrets and lies. Nathan Cross had reached out to me after the trial ended. He'd wanted to collaborate on a book about what had happened. I declined. But I acknowledged that his investigation, flawed as it was, had exposed truths that needed exposing. We'd met for coffee a few weeks before I started school. "I'm sorry for how I handled things," Nathan said. "I let my personal vendetta override your welfare. That was wrong." It was, I acknowledged. But you also exposed the truth. And that truth needed to be exposed, even if your motivations were complicated. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" Nathan asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I know that I can acknowledge that you did something that helped me, even though you did it for the wrong reasons. Whether that's forgiveness, I'm not sure." We left things on neutral ground. Not friendly, but not hostile either. Just two people who'd been entangled in an intense situation and had managed to emerge without completely destroying each other. My adoptive mother reached out to me 6 months after my father's sentencing. She was living in a small apartment by herself. Richard's assets had been significantly depleted by legal fees and restitution to embezzlement victims. She was working part-time as a consultant, trying to rebuild her life from scratch. "I want you to know that I understand if you don't want a relationship with me," she wrote in a letter. "I failed you. I chose your father over protecting you. I made that choice consciously and repeatedly. I don't expect forgiveness." I didn't respond immediately. I thought about it for weeks. Eventually, I agreed to meet with her. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop I'd never been to before, and we talked for 2 hours. She cried. She apologized. She explained that she was in therapy working on understanding her own trauma and how it had led her to enable my father's behavior. "I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid of your father. I was afraid of losing everything. I was afraid of the truth. So I just accepted his version of events and tried not to think too deeply about what that meant." "That's understandable," I said. "But it meant that I suffered." "I know," she said. "And I have to live with that knowledge. I have to accept that my fear caused your pain. That's something I'm working through in therapy." We didn't become close. We didn't suddenly develop a warm mother-daughter relationship. But we established something that felt more honest. We acknowledged what had happened. We acknowledged that it had damaged us both. We agreed that we could maintain limited contact without pretending that the damage hadn't occurred. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a kind of peace. Thomas took longer. My brother was in college when the trial ended, and he'd transferred schools specifically to get away from the media attention surrounding our family. He didn't contact me for almost a year after the verdict. When he finally did, it was through a letter. "I was angry at you for a long time," he wrote. "I blamed you for destroying our family. But I've had time to think about it, and I understand now that our family was already destroyed. You just made the destruction visible." He said he was ready to talk if I was. We met during my winter break from school. We went for a walk in a park near my apartment. We talked about our childhood. We talked about the moments when we'd known something was wrong but had been afraid to acknowledge it. "I remember you crying in the hallway once," Thomas said, "when you were about 13. And I asked you what was wrong, and you said nothing. But it wasn't nothing. You were already starting to understand that something was wrong with our family." "I was trying to protect you," I said. "I didn't want you to have to carry the same burden I was carrying." "I know," Thomas said. "And I appreciate that, even though you shouldn't have had to. You were a child. You shouldn't have been responsible for protecting me." We started seeing each other regularly after that. We rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully, acknowledging that the foundation it had been built on was false, but trying to construct something more authentic. 9 months after the trial ended, I received a scholarship to study journalism at a prestigious university. The scholarship was specifically for students who'd experienced significant trauma and wanted to tell stories that honored that experience. I was accepted into the program, and my biological family threw me a celebration dinner. Priya made traditional Indian food. My siblings brought friends. We danced and laughed and celebrated the fact that I was moving forward with my life. At one point, Priya pulled me aside and said, "Your father would be proud of you." She meant my biological father, Ashok, the man I'd never met. The man whose murder had set all of this in motion. "Thank you," I said. "I wish he could have known me." "I think he does," Priya said. "I think he's watching over us." I didn't believe in that kind of supernatural presence, but I appreciated the sentiment. I appreciated that my biological family had welcomed me not just as a legal claim, but as an actual part of their lives. 2 years after the trial ended, I published my first major journalistic piece. It was about adoption fraud and how the legal system failed vulnerable children. It included interviews with other people who'd been adopted through unethical means. It included expert analysis from social workers and law enforcement. And it included my own story, carefully told in a way that honored my trauma without being sensationalized. The piece was published in a major journalism outlet and won recognition from several journalism organizations. More importantly, it led to legislative change. The state where I lived passed a new law requiring greater transparency in adoption records. It required more thorough investigations into adoption circumstances. It gave adult adoptees greater access to their own adoption files. My story, as painful as it had been to live through, became a tool for protecting other children. I started receiving messages from other people who'd been through similar situations. Some had been adopted through fraud. Some had been used as leverage in custody disputes. Some had been kept from their biological families through legal manipulation. Their stories fueled my determination to keep telling stories that mattered. 3 years after my father's conviction, I graduated from my journalism program with top honors. Victoria came to my graduation. So did my entire biological family. My adoptive mother came too, sitting separately from my biological family, but present nonetheless. After the ceremony, standing with my diploma in my hand, I felt something I hadn't anticipated feeling. I felt whole, not healed. Healing is an ongoing process that never really completes itself. but whole in the sense that I'd integrated all the fragments of my story into a coherent narrative. I understood who I was not in spite of what had happened to me, but partially because of what had happened to me. I'd survived. I'd told the truth. I'd faced consequences I couldn't have anticipated. I'd rebuilt relationships. I'd transformed pain into purpose. The cave where my father had left me when I was 18 months old still existed, somewhere in a remote region far away. But I no longer defined myself by the abandonment that had occurred there. I defined myself by the fact that someone had found me, that I'd been rescued, that despite everything I'd survived. 6 months after graduation, I was offered a position as an investigative journalist at a major news outlet. The position came with the opportunity to tell stories about systems that failed vulnerable people. Stories about corruption and abuse of power. Stories about people who'd survived impossible situations. I accepted the position. On my first day, I walked into the office and felt nervous in a way I hadn't felt since testifying in my father's trial. But this nervousness was different. This was the nervousness of someone stepping into something meaningful, something challenging, something that mattered. My editor, a woman named Rebecca, pulled me aside on my first day. "I know your background," she said. "I know what you've been through. I want to be clear that I'm not hiring you because of that. I'm hiring you because you're a talented investigative journalist who knows how to tell important stories." "Thank you," I said. "But I also want you to know that if you need support, if you need time off, if the work gets too intense, I'm here," Rebecca said. "We all carry trauma. The key is not pretending we don't." I felt something settle in me at that moment. This was a space where my trauma didn't have to be invisible, where my pain could coexist with my professional competence, where I could be both broken and capable. My first assignment was to investigate a series of adoption fraud cases in our state, cases that fit the pattern of what had happened to me. As I began my research, I reached out to the prosecutor for my father's case, Sarah Chen. She provided me with case files and connections to law enforcement officials who'd worked on similar investigations. I interviewed families who'd been separated through fraudulent adoptions. I interviewed social workers who'd recognized patterns of abuse. I interviewed lawyers who'd fought to protect vulnerable children. And I realized that my father's case was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern. There were systems in place that allowed powerful people to manipulate vulnerable populations. There were loopholes that enabled fraud. There were ways to make problems disappear if you had enough money and power. But there were also people fighting against those systems. People like Sarah Chen. People like Victoria. People like Margaret Sullivan who'd testified about her own experience. People like Nathan Cross, despite his complicated motivations. Justice, I learned, didn't come from a single moment or a single verdict. Justice was an ongoing process. It was about exposing systems that failed. It was about creating accountability. It was about giving voice to people whose voices had been silenced. My investigation led to my second major published piece, which resulted in further legislative changes. It led to investigation of multiple adoption agencies. It led to criminal charges against people involved in adoption fraud. And it led to me finding my purpose. I was no longer the confused girl who'd met Nathan Cross at her workplace. I was no longer the traumatized young woman sobbing in a hospital bed. I was no longer the person who'd been used as a tool of control and manipulation. I was an investigative journalist committed to exposing truth and holding power accountable. I was a daughter, both biological and adoptive, learning how to build healthy relationships despite fractured foundations. I was a survivor who'd transformed her trauma into something that helped other survivors. I was Evelyn Hartwell, and I was finally becoming the person I was supposed to be. 3 years after my father's conviction, I received a letter from Richard. He was writing from federal prison. His letter was carefully written, each word considered. He told me he understood that there was no redemption for what he'd done. He told me he understood that my forgiveness was not his to claim. He told me he was grateful that I'd survived, that I'd thrived, that I'd become someone remarkable despite what he'd done to me. He told me he was sorry. Not the performative apology he'd offered in the courtroom, but a genuine acknowledgement that he'd caused irreparable harm and that no amount of remorse could undo that harm. He told me he was proud of me. I didn't respond. I didn't know what I would say that wouldn't feel like either condoning what he'd done or prolonging a relationship that needed to remain in the past. But I read the letter. And I acknowledged that even my father was capable of some level of growth and self-awareness, however limited. That didn't make what he'd done acceptable. But it made his humanity visible in a way I'd thought it couldn't be. Life after the trial became a process of learning to live with complexity. I learned that justice was not always complete or perfect. That people who'd harmed me could also be capable of remorse. That my biological and adoptive families could coexist in my life without canceling each other out. I learned that trauma didn't define me, but it also didn't disappear. It became part of my story, integrated into who I was, but no longer the central narrative. I learned that being broken and being strong were not mutually exclusive. That vulnerability and power could exist simultaneously. And I learned that my story, as devastating as it had been, had the potential to help other people, to expose systems that failed, to create change that protected vulnerable people. 5 years after my father's conviction, I was nominated for a journalism award for my investigation into adoption fraud and systemic failures. I didn't win. But the fact that I was nominated meant something to me. It meant that my work mattered. It meant that transforming pain into purpose had created something that helped other people. At the awards ceremony, I sat with my biological family on one side and my adoptive mother on the other. Not perfectly healed. Not completely at peace, but present. All of us present and acknowledging what had happened and moving forward anyway. Looking back on everything that had occurred, the investigation, the trial, the fallout, the rebuilding, I could finally see the shape of my own growth. I could see how surviving something devastating had made me stronger. How telling the truth had liberated me. How transforming my trauma into stories that helped others had given my suffering meaning. I could see that I'd gone from being a girl who accepted lies to survive to becoming a woman who pursued truth despite the cost. And I could see that journey wasn't over. It would never be completely over. But that was okay. That was what it meant to be a survivor. You didn't complete your journey and then stop. You integrated what had happened into who you were. You used your survival to help other people survive. You told stories that mattered. You built a life that meant something. You moved forward.